First puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes knight, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are: rook takes knight, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: bishop takes pawn, check. King to c1. Queen to e5. Knight takes bishop. Queen to a1, check. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are: rook takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Knight to f3, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to d4. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes knight. f3. Knight takes bishop. One more. The threats are: knight takes knight. Here are checks in puzzle position. Knight to c7, check. Solution to the puzzle is: knight takes knight. King takes knight. King to f4. King to e6. King to e4. f5, check. King to d4. King to f6. King takes pawn. King to e5. King to d3. King to f4. King to e2. Next, puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: rook to d1. Bishop takes pawn, check. King to h1. Bishop to d4. Bishop to e3. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. h4. d6, check. King to d8. c6. h3. c7, check. King to d7. King to b6. h2. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: bishop takes rook, check. Queen takes rook, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen takes rook, check. King to h2. Bishop to g4. d4. Bishop takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. The checks are: bishop takes pawn, check. Queen to g5, check. The answer is: queen to g5, check. King to h7. Bishop takes pawn. Rook to g8. Bishop to g7. Bishop takes bishop. Bishop to g6, check. King to h8. Queen to h4, check. Knight to h5. Queen takes knight, check. Bishop to h6. Queen takes bishop, checkmate. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes knight. Queen takes knight. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Knight to e6, check. Queen to h6, check. The best move in puzzle position is: pawn takes pawn. Knight takes knight. Queen to h6, check. King to e8. Queen to h8, check. King to d7. Bishop to a4, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes knight. Knight takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to b3, check. Rook takes rook, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen to f2. Knight to e6. Rook takes knight. Queen takes queen. Rook takes rook, check. Rook takes rook. Rook takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are: rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in this position are: queen to f4, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn, check. King to e7. Queen to g5, check. King to f8. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: king takes knight, rook takes pawn, queen takes knight check, queen takes pawn check, knight takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: queen to f2 check, queen takes knight check, queen takes pawn check. The best move in puzzle position is queen to f2 check, king to d1, rook takes pawn, rook takes rook, queen takes knight check. Next, the threats are: queen takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. The checks are: queen to c4 check, queen to d5 check, queen to h7 check, queen to b3 check, bishop to b3 check. Here is the solution to the puzzle: queen to h7 check, king to f8, bishop to b3, rook to e6, bishop takes pawn. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position: queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to g8 check. The answer is rook to g4, e4. Rook takes pawn, queen takes pawn, rook to h3, queen takes pawn, rook to h5, queen to g5, rook takes queen. Let's continue. Here are the threats: knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn check, knight takes pawn check, knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn, queen takes pawn check, queen takes pawn check. Checks in puzzle position are: knight to h5 check, knight takes pawn check, knight takes pawn check, queen to g2 check, queen takes pawn check, queen to h2 check, queen to h3 check, queen takes pawn check, queen to g1 check, queen to e1 check. The best move in puzzle position is e5. Queen takes pawn, queen to g1 check, king to h3, queen to e3. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is king to b5, rook to e2, king to b4, queen to b8, king to a3, queen takes pawn check, rook to a5. Another puzzle. Threats in this position are: promotes to queen check, promotes to rook check, promotes to bishop, promotes to knight, promotes to queen, promotes to rook, promotes to bishop, promotes to knight, knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Promotes to queen check, promotes to rook check, knight to b6 check. Answer to this puzzle is queen to f3, knight to e5, queen to e4. Another one. The threats are: knight takes pawn check, bishop takes pawn, rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position: knight to f6 check, knight takes pawn check, bishop to h7 check. Solution to the puzzle is: knight takes pawn check, pawn takes knight, queen to g4 check, king to h8, rook to f6, bishop takes pawn check, king to g1. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: bishop takes pawn check, rook takes bishop, rook takes pawn, rook takes pawn. Checks in this position are: bishop takes pawn check, rook to f1 check, rook to e2 check. The answer is before. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn check, king to d1, king to f4, king to c1, king to e3. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using a4, f3, king to e3, pawn takes pawn, king to f2, promotes to rook, king takes rook. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes pawn, rook takes bishop check. The checks are: rook takes bishop check. Answer to this puzzle is queen to d3, queen takes queen, rook takes bishop check, king to f8, pawn takes queen. Let's continue. Threats in this position are: pawn takes pawn check. The checks are d4 check, Pawn takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. c4. a3. a6. a4. a5. King to e5. King takes pawn. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Checks in puzzle position are. Rook to d1, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Bishop to a6, check. Queen to f4, check. Queen to f3, check. Queen to f2, check. Queen to g1, check. Queen to e2, check. Queen to e1, check. Queen to c1, check. Queen to d3, check. The answer is bishop to a6, check. Knight to b5. Rook to d5. Queen to f2. Bishop takes knight, check. King to g1. Queen to h6. h3. Knight to e4. Queen to f3. Queen to b6, check. King to h2. Queen to d6, check. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. There are no threats in this position. Checks in this position are. e3, check. g3, check. The best move in puzzle position is g3, check. King to g1. g2. Knight to d5, check. King to e5. Knight to e3. King to d4. Knight takes pawn. King takes knight. Next, the threats are. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are. Queen to g6, check. Queen to h7, check. Rook to h7, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Queen to h7, check. King to f6. Knight to e4, check. King to e6. Knight to c5, check. Pawn takes knight. Queen to e4, check. King to d7. Queen takes pawn, check. Another one. Threats in puzzle position are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. King to d4. f4. Pawn takes pawn. King to c2. f3. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.